Of course, there can be no other topic than the obscenity that is unfolding in Gaza. The moral outrage, an endless stream, an endless stream of images of human suffering, with a world, with a Western world in particular, with that part of the world that, whether we like it or not, has led the world morally, has defined the ethics of our modern institutions, for better or for worse. For the past centuries, it is a small percentage of the world that has defined the rules of the game globally. That small percentage that not too long ago were express and explicit colonial powers that took upon themselves the so-called civilizing mission in the world. Colonial powers that colonized, dominated, subjugated numerous indigenous cultures, all under sometimes well developed and rather sophisticated ideologies of civilization and new philosophical and moral frontiers, and other times rather vague and many times incoherent and paradoxical ideologies of, again, civilization and carrying humanity to its destiny, etc., etc. That part of the world, for all the different reasons and whatever the reasons, because I don't want to get into that, which colonialism ended formally, continued, however, to define the moral institutions of the world we live in. It was largely a European and American idea to build the United Nations after the League of Nations. Again, it was Europe and the United States that led the effort to draft the UN Charter, the basic constitutional organizing document for the world that we live in today. It is with also the same parties that, for the most part, defined the rules of the game within the institution of the United Nations The rules as spelled out by the UN Charter and again, this part of the world that played the pioneering role in drafting the Geneva Conventions that were supposed to define humanitarian standards in the midst of the most ugly and brutal realities of human beings, and that is a state of war. The very point of the Geneva Conventions and the very point of humanitarian law by the very same nations, the United States and largely Western Europe, for the most part, for the critical part, for all the parts that matter, the Geneva Conventions were supposed to be an acknowledgement that wars in which human beings indulge in zero-sum games, in which powerful parties vow to fight till victory at any price and at any cost, or regardless of the price and regardless of the cost, are fundamentally immoral wars. That was the stark realization that when nations decide that they've been wronged and vow to fight until total victory, until they obtain the complete submission of their foe, their enemy, that the sheer human cost in doing so is so obscene that it is unacceptable. Any educated person knows that with the shocking price paid in World War II for these zero-sum games, zero-sum conflicts, we will fight to eradicate, not negotiate, not compromise, not reach a settlement, not in any way coexist, but to vanquish and erase our enemy, are indeed wars of such enormous costs for human beings that the whole edifice of the UN Charter, the two covenants for civil and political rights and for economic and cultural rights, the Geneva Conventions, the various treaties and instruments on human rights of every kind and type, were all supposed to be, we've learned from the brutality of World War II, and we do not want to repeat the sheer inhumanity of what took place when these colonial powers started struggling for bigger shares of the cake, for greater power over indigenous cultures and indigenous people, a bigger share in power and control, because in essence, what ignited fascism in places like Germany and Italy, and even what drove the Japanese assault upon the United States. In all these ideologies, what allowed these ideologies that inspired the leadership of these countries, what allowed these ideologies to become popular and to appeal to people and to deceive and trick people and to excite the imagination of people was fundamentally about shares, about the gains of British colonialism, about American hegemony in the Pacific, about the shares of French colonialism, and the persistent sense among Italian and German and Japanese intellectuals that it is unfair because with the current distribution of shares, we will always be second to the dominant colonial powers in the world. Germany will never become as rich, as resource rich as France or Britain. Japan consistently complained about how small its sphere of influence was in the Pacific, and always complained in the years leading up to the war of American hegemony and American interventionism. The point is that we led an experiment when human beings allow the cause to drive their conduct and forgo moral restraints and ethical reservations because they believe that their cause is just. The type of situation where what matters is the end pursued, regardless of the means. The whole experience of modernity post World War II was that this type of scenario results in endless misery for human beings. Precisely that these types of wars, just in terms of their collateral damage and harm and suffering, are unbearable, leave alone undesirable, but simply unbearable. Now, so all these institutions, even institutions like the Red Cross or like the various organizations within the United Nations that are supposed to monitor the legality of state conduct, is all premised on the idea that we are not going to repeat the mistake of saying a just cause, assuming the existence of a just cause, will not again justify any means. Not again justify the lack of restraint in the pursuit of what a party believes to be a just cause. This is so critical because what is happening in Gaza is that Muslims wake up, and especially these recent generations that have not experienced 1948, generations that know very little about 1967, generations that have no real memory of the ethnic cleansing that took place in Palestine, and no real memory of even the legacy of colonialism and what it means. We wake up today with a world in which the very same powers that created the institutions of normative morality in our modern world seem to be intent on betraying every principle they crafted and supported since World War II. This is the reality that Muslims wake up to and are waking up to today. Let's go back and let's take a step back. You and I have not seen evidence that is alleged by Israel and the United States of the atrocities claimed by Israel to have taken place. You and I have not seen murdered Israeli babies, whether decapitated or not. We have not seen evidence of the type of atrocities. What I did see, what is evidence that would lead me to believe that Palestinian fighters shot and killed unarmed Israelis who were not wearing military fatigue. In other words, they were wearing civilian clothes, which is clearly a violation of the rules of war. And that would be a war crime, in fact, if these people were civilians. And if Hamas fighters shot them in cold blood, that's a clear violation. But as I have said repeatedly, the way that we ascertain facts on the ground when you have allegations of atrocities being committed is to engage the very processes and institutions that the very same countries, the United States and the West, have created to investigate the claims of such atrocities taking place. Let's step away. There are claims that Burma committed a genocide against Muslims. There are institutions to investigate this claim, to ascertain the facts. But imagine a world in which there is actually a powerful Muslim country that can act the way Israel acts, or that can act the way the United States acts. And imagine that without an investigation, without any verification, without resort to any process, simply on the basis of journalistic evidence and the oral testimony of survivors, that Muslim country decides to send Burma a message and proceeds to bombard Burma to a pulp. Not just bombard Burma to target military installations and people that are clearly wearing the insignia of being fighters, but simply level Burma to the ground. Can you imagine the world sitting silently? Let's pretend that there is a very powerful Muslim country in the world we live in. And simply on the basis of the evidence available to date, that China has engaged in the ethnic cleansing of Muslims and an actual genocide against Muslims in China, that powerful Muslim country tells the world, I'm not in the mood for any investigations. I'm not in the mood for any discussions, any back and forth. What I'm going to do is I am going to level Peking. I am going to reduce the capital of China to rubble. Imagine the reaction of the civilized Western world then. Why even go this far? Imagine if there was a powerful Muslim country, and upon the occurrence of the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, in which more Palestinians were killed than Israelis were killed on October 7th. More Palestinians were killed in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila in this one day than Israelis were killed on October 7th. Imagine if the response to this by this powerful Muslim country is, that's it, we're fed up, we've been massacred by Israelis since 1948. This follows in a long string of massacres. This is it. We are going to go to war against Israel until complete and total victory is achieved. And in order to obtain complete and total victory, we're going to do what the very logic of complete and total victory dictates and necessitates, is that you pound your enemy to a pulp. So imagine if the response to Sabra and Shatila was that this powerful Muslim country said, this is it, we're going to start bombing Tel Aviv. we're going to start bombing Israeli cities until we level everything that we think is of potentially military significance. Imagine the reaction of the world then. To be very clear, even when Sabra and Shatila took place, even when this massacre took place, every militant response to the massacre was condemned by the West. And I remember these days very well. And the response was always, you can't punish Israelis for what Sharon did. Sharon doesn't represent the Israeli people. You can't punish, in fact, even the Israeli military for the militant and fanatic faction led by Sharon. This is the thing. And the very logic that is transplanted to us from our experience with modernity is that the claim of civilization is founded on the power of distinction. Civilized people distinguish. And when the West wants to invoke the civilizational card, they distinguish. And when the West accuses us of not being civilized, they effectively accuse us of failing to distinguish. That we have a mentality that is too unsophisticated to realize distinctions. But then we wake up to a day, the now, in which all distinctions seem to have evaporated. All the institutions, everyone knows, everyone agrees. Even I don't think the Biden administration itself can deny that the Geneva Conventions are being violated. We have a judgment of the International Court of Justice years ago that said that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is an ongoing and systematic violation of international law. Years ago, when Israel started building its walls of separation, when Israel started or developed its institutions of apartheid and subjugation of the Palestinian people, the entire world said this violates human rights principles. Let's fully realize what is taking place. Because just being clear about the facts is very important. A corrupt, racist, supremacist leader came to power in Israel. When that leader came to power, he brought with him other Israeli politicians like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who firmly believe that none of all this decorum of the institutions of modern international law, people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich are on record saying we have no regard for what the Geneva Conventions or what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, or what any of the rules of international law say when it comes to our conflict with Arabs and Muslims. They are on numerous times on record saying that. As far as we're concerned, we can bomb Syria as many times as we want. We can bomb Iran as many times as we want. We can bomb Lebanon as many times as we want. If the Egyptians don't obey us and play and follow what we tell them, we'll bomb the Egyptians. We can displace the Palestinian population. We can ethnically cleanse any and all of that. It doesn't matter because we don't believe in all these nice institutions that were built after World War II. Now, that same government, upon the occurrence of this attack, and this attack didn't come out of a vacuum, any reasonably intelligent person could have told you things are going to blow up because since Netanyahu and his government came to power, they have made a habit of violating the sanctity of the Aqsa Mosque. Something that, by the way, continues till even just yesterday. And they have made a habit of allowing settlers to abuse and murder Palestinians without accountability. And they pretty much given the IDF a blank card to kill as many Palestinians as they wish, making it very clear that no Israeli military is going to be held to account for killing a Palestinian or maiming a Palestinian. Now, that same government, upon the occurrence of this attack, started engaging the PR game, telling us at one time that Hamas cut off the heads of babies. That same government claimed that Hamas engaged in the mass rape and mass assault, sexual assault of Israeli women, claimed that Hamas murdered Israeli children, and extremely unreliable because of the pattern and practice, the habit of that same government of persistently and consistently lying about what Palestinians do or not do. Clearly, this government has no moral reservations about lying. Suddenly, the entire West, the same West that in theory condemns racism, led an entire world war to counter supremacist ideologies. The same West that says supremacists and fascists should not be believed and should not followed, in a moment did precisely what they have been telling the world not to do, at least since World War II. And that is accept the narrative and testimony of supremacist and fascist parties as beyond impeachment and as absolute truth. Let that sink in for a second. I saw on Israeli TV. And anyone that wants to see this clip, I would be happy to send it to them. Because someone that I know preserved the clip. The clip is of an Israeli woman, a young, attractive Israeli woman. She's being interviewed on Israeli TV, and she talks about how Hamas soldiers came and they finally broke the door that she had locked, where she and four others were hiding. And that upon breaking the door, the Israeli correspondent asks her, did they assault you? Did they abuse you? Did they mistreat you? And she says, with complete calm, no, actually, they treated us really well. They told us that not to fear, not to be scared, that they're Muslim. And this is not the famous interview where you have a woman wearing eyeglasses that everyone saw. It's a younger woman. And she says to the Israeli correspondent, they gave us water. They told us that they are going to be there for a few hours, but they're not going to hurt us. And I saw this clip once, and it was promptly removed and disappeared. And I thought I lost it until I found that this other person that I follow had actually downloaded it and preserved it. The account that downloaded it and preserved it is called MuhibTube. The interview is in Hebrew. And it is clear that it was promptly removed. All I'm saying is you cannot trust, in the same way that I won't believe Hamas blindly when it says it did X or Y or Z. You cannot trust blindly a source like the Netanyahu government, a source with a clear track record of hatred against Palestinians and Arabs and persistent lies. Nevertheless, even if we assume, and this is a critical point, for the sake of argument, let's assume that indeed Hamas committed all the atrocities which we accused Hamas of committing, although not one video of an Israeli child, murdered Israeli child, was produced. Every picture in which Israel or Israeli supporters claimed these are Israeli children, it turned out to be Palestinian children who were in the pictures. Anyway, let's assume that Hamas committed all the atrocities that Israel indeed accuses Hamas of committing. The very logic of human rights, the very logic of humanitarian law, the very logic of the institutions, the normative institutions that were built after World War II, say that just because your enemy is a criminal, it doesn't mean that you can be a criminal as well. That's the whole, that was support. Millions of people died in World War II. Millions upon millions of people lost their lives in World War II just so humanity can learn this lesson. If you meet evil with evil, all that remains on the face of this earth is evil. The whole edifice of the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter and everything else is that no longer will we engage in the equations of colonialism. What are the equations of colonialism? This is the precise scenario that took place throughout the colonial era. European settlers go somewhere. European settlers are assaulted, murdered, raped, mutilated by what European settlers call barbarians, meaning indigenous people. Whether this took place in South America, or in North America, or Africa, or Asia, it was always the same precise equation. European settlers are assaulted by natives. Natives are barbarians. So, what does the equation dictate? Colonialism comes in and wipes out the natives, punishes the assault against the colonizer through total victory. Through total victory. The very logic of total victory was a genocidal logic. Because you cannot be totally victorious over a people unless you completely vanquish them. And so, again, people, because it is incredible that I see even law professors seem to have become suddenly stupid, morons. The very logic of the institutions of human rights and humanitarian law is that no more. A wrong cannot justify genocides. A genocide cannot be countered with another genocide. Just because you suffered a genocide, it doesn't mean you have the right to commit a genocide. So the very logic of modern institutions of morality and normativity of law is that there are rules even when you have a completely just cause on your side. Everyone agrees, even I am sure everyone in the Biden administration knows that what Israel is doing in Gaza violates about 100 provisions in the Geneva Conventions. Everyone knows bombing hospitals, even bombing UNRWA schools. Why are we kidding ourselves? Just recently, I saw a report that there were 100,000 in 1 week instances of extreme hate speech against Palestinians and Muslims in one country alone, in Israel, on Twitter. 100,000 instances of extreme hate speech. When I say extreme hate speech, means these are animals, wipe them out. And of course, Twitter, not one instance of intervention by Twitter to do anything about the genocidal discourse in Israel against Palestine. Everyone knows that what the Netanyahu government is espousing is a genocidal war. And everyone knows that the very rules, that the very powers today that stand with Israel drafted, authored, theorized, invented the very rules that say you don't target hospitals, you don't target schools, you don't go after UNRWA for institutions, you don't cut off water, you don't cut off electricity. Even the obscenity of the aid caravan at the Egyptian border, which hasn't entered yet. 20 trucks, people. 20 trucks. This whole hoopla is about 20 trucks. What do you think 20 trucks are going to do in a population like Gaza's? That's aid for about 1 minute. And yet the obscenity of the entire world going back and forth. Oh, well, the 20 trucks are in, they're out, they're not in, they're delayed. That's nothing. Now, this is the whole point. I mentioned in my previous khutbah that there is an obsession that seems to be nestled in the Israeli mind. And the obsession is that we have defeated the Palestinians and the Palestinians should have surrendered. That the reason we are not observing the terms of the Oslo Accords is because why should we give terms to a people we've defeated? Astoundingly, when you listen to what's the name of the Ben Shapiro on the British show, on the Piers Morgan show, when you listen to Ben Shapiro, recently Piers Morgan interviewed Ben Shapiro's partner and closest friend, and it blew my mind. What this idiot was talking about is that he's saying since World War II, the West seems like the West have forgotten how to win a war. And the problem is that since World War II, we don't fight to win. And he cited Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. This is the same thing I've heard from Ben Shapiro. This is supposed to be your very intelligent, high IQ guy. Do you know what it means to win a total victory? What you are effectively saying, the last time we nuked a country was in World War II in Japan. What we should have done in Vietnam is that in order to achieve total victory, wiped out our enemy. And what we've done wrong in Afghanistan and what we've done wrong in Iraq is that there is an Afghanistan still standing and Iraq still standing. The very logic of total victory that these people are fantasizing about means going back to the paradigms of either victor or vanquished. And the vanquished is like old Talmudic laws of victory, where you put all the men to the sword, you enslave the women, and you bash the heads of babies against trees. What Ben Shapiro and his partner are actually saying, and Piers Morgan is allowing them to say it without even a response, is the absolutely obscene logic of let's go back, but this time allow the Holocaust to take place. This time the Holocaust is not against Jews, but against Muslims. They are bemoaning and decrying that they did not attain a full victory in Afghanistan and Iraq. Meaning what? We should have nuked the Taliban, because that was the only way to attain a complete victory. We should have nuked Iraq so that Iraq loses even its will to live. And for sure, that is what they're saying exactly about Palestine. Wake up, people. This is what they're fantasizing about. We want a complete and total victory. Even Biden says, yes, Hamas has to be wiped out. Do you know what the logic of wiped out means? Do you, if fundamentally Israel is bombing hospitals and schools and homes and saying Hamas is in all of these places, so by the very logic, people, I don't know what happened to logic. I really, I'm in the twilight zone. It's like people have ceased to be able to think. If Israel right now is telling us Hamas is in the hospital, is in the school, is in the home, Hamas is in the mosque, okay, in order to wipe out Hamas, as Biden says must happen, how are you going to do that without wiping out the hospital, the mosque, the school? And what happens to the people in the mosque, in the hospital, in the school? The logic of total victory. So, what we are confronting is a very ugly and stark reality. The very people who invented the rules of war in modernity, the very academics and intellectuals and politicians that authored the Geneva Conventions, that authored the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that said that we don't live in an age of victor and vanquished, that said no more, not again to the laws of, to the wars of colonialism, where an indigenous population commits an atrocity, so you wipe them off the face of the earth. The very people who said no more to the logic of total, unrestrained, unfettered war have abandoned their ideals. And what is truly shocking is that they affirmed something that Muslims suspected all along, is that our ideals don't include you Muslims. That when it comes to dealing with you Muslims, we are willing to forego our ideals and to forget our ideals and put our ideals to the side. Every politician who has supports not that does not support a ceasefire, every politician who is not condemning what Israel is doing, knows fully well that they are trampling upon humanitarian law, human rights law, all the human rights ideals, that they are saying just because Israel was wronged, Israel can become medieval again. And we are allowing a medieval exception when it comes to Muslims. When it comes to Muslims, go medieval on them. Do the medieval thing. Do the Taurati, the Talmudic thing of obliterating your enemy. That is indeed a new challenge and a new world. When I say do the Talmudic thing, the Taurati thing, this, of course, the way in Deuteronomy, the laws of war in Deuteronomy, and what you do to the vanquished enemy, the defeated enemy. Something that through the hard work of Jewish moralists and Jewish ethical theologians was reinterpreted, rearticulated, deconstructed, and challenged. In other words, what is being lost among the gazillion things being lost in this obscenity and ugliness is Jewish ethics and the hard work of Jewish theologians and moralists. But anyway, that's the sidebar. Okay. So now I just want to take a minute and identify the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room, without a shadow of a doubt, is not the fact that the West has decided to betray its own principles. Is not even the fact that the West perhaps has never believed in its own principles when it comes to Muslims. The elephant in the room is not the fact that the world, the so-called civilized, democratic world, is not even that it is abandoning all what it claimed to have believed in and adhered to and adopted since World War II. The elephant in the room is Muslim weakness. How weak and vulnerable we are. Listen, our weakness was painfully evident when in 1948, if you compare the way Al Saud fought for the Hijaz, in other words, the way they surrounded and suffocated Hijaz until it gave up their fighting power, their fighting energy in fighting fellow Muslims, killing and murdering fellow Muslims, and compare their fight to the fight of Arabs in 1948, it would clearly tell you who's in charge. it would clearly tell you who is giving orders and who is carrying out orders. But we were weak in 48. We were weak in 67. Even 1973, in which, but we are always on the weak side. And the reason we are always weak is two distinct reasons. Whether Israel or the West, whether Britain or France or America, they don't fight the people. They fight appointed rulers and leaders. In other words, look at whether you agree with them or not, that's not the point. But look at what the absence of an Arab leader does in the case of Hezbollah or the case of Hamas. Imagine right now, in all the demonstrations that took place all over the Muslim world, the chant of the Muslim masses is open the borders, allow us to go volunteer to help our Muslim brothers. Imagine if you had rulers in the Muslim world that actually translated this into a reality. If you are going to victimize the Gazans, that means you're going to have to go to war with all of us Muslims. Imagine if the logic that was followed by Muslims is the very same logic that confronts us when we deal with Israel. Time and time and time again, in confronting Israeli violence, what we very quickly learn is it's not just fighting Israel. It's fighting Israel and the United States and Britain and France and so many other European countries who basically tell any Israeli enemy, Israel doesn't stand alone. As we speak, there are Americans who have already packed up and flew to Israel to join the war effort against Palestinians. They are allowed to do so by law, and there will be no legal repercussions because our laws does not designate Israeli forces as a terroristic force, and joining them in murdering Palestinians is not an act of terrorism. But no Muslim or Arab leader dares allow his people to translate sympathy with the Palestinians into any type of action. Muslim weakness is undeniable. The other reality that is also part of the Muslim weakness, from as far back as I can remember, from the days I was a child, I grew up with the ingrained idea that the big boogeyman, the scary monster, is Israeli air power. Since the 60s, when I was growing up, Israel goes wherever it wants, bombs wherever it wants, kills whoever it wants, using air power. And that reality continued, not just from the 60s till now, but we saw this reality in the weakness of Iraq and its inability to fend off an invasion, air power. And in every conflict in which Muslims found themselves on the other side, now I often wondered what allows for this absolute supremacy from the air. And I've done the exercise of imagining what it would take for a Muslim country to actually develop a type of weapon that can counter the absolute air supremacy that Israel has. And you know what is required? What is required are institutions of research and experiment. You have to rechannel your resources to support every brilliant young scientist who might have an idea that would lead to the scientific advancement and progress that would lead us to know how to prevent an airplane from bombing Muslims with impunity. But in order to have these resources, you need to fund research, 90% of which will lead to nothing, because that's the nature of scientific research. But you must be able to protect your scientists. You must be able to fund the experiments and the trial and error of your scientists. And you must be able to commit the resources to carry out the scientific imagination into actual prototypes. But you cannot do that. It is impossible to do that if you do not have your own political will. If basically your country is so corrupt that there are spies at every corner, and if your scientists, because you are so compromised, are so vulnerable that they can be assassinated at any time, you cannot do that if your military and your elite is so corrupt that the funds that could be dedicated to scientific research, trial and error, are diverted to the pockets of corrupt generals who spend this money in bank accounts in Switzerland and bank accounts in Dubai and villas and cars and yachts. It is a complete whole. Muslim rulers, authoritarian dictators that do not represent their people are the ailment for our weakness, because it is impossible with this type of leadership to even start down the road that would provide some counterbalance that would actually be a favor to Europe in restoring its rationality, in quenching the insanity of bloodlust. In other words, when the powerful is met with counterpower, the powerful often calm down, pause, and think, rather than just unleashing their Muslims have to abandon thought about everything else and focus on rehabilitating the art of governance in Muslim worlds. Muslims in the United States and Europe must become the active agents in through the institutions of power in the United States and Europe, becoming the mechanism for forcing reform and change in the Muslim world. Because the current, if you want to understand who is truly responsible for the genocide taking place in Palestine right now, who is truly responsible are the rulers, Muslim rulers, who allow this to happen, who are so weak that neither the United States, nor Israel, nor any other power gives them any weight or any regard. I'm going to finish with this one example because it is truly shocking and needs to be preserved in history. I don't know how many of you watched the president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, with the German chancellor or the German politician he spoke with. In the course, Sisi is regularly an idiot. I mean, he says idiotic things all the time. But this, it really shows the quality of the types of people who rule over Muslim populations. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi wanted to say that Egypt is completely opposed to the displacement of Palestinians and forcing Palestinians into the desert in Sinai. But in the course of saying so he says Egypt is completely opposed to exiling Palestinians and pushing them into Sinai. Okay, fine. But in the course of saying this, he says something that is unbelievable. He says, well, if Israel wanted to, instead of you, Germany and Britain and the US trying to pressure Egypt to allow the Palestinians to be settled in Sinai, he proposes, this is live, he says, well, Israel has this desert in the Naqab area. The Naqab is this vast desert that along the Egyptian border that is unsettled. There's nothing there. And he says, Israel has the Naqab area, the Naqab desert. Israel can instead displace the Palestinians to the Naqab desert until they finish their war and destroy Hamas, and then allow the Palestinians back to Gaza if they want. Now, of course, this is all Freudian slips. He was not at this point reading from a text. He was just speaking freely. But it really betrays how lowly and submissive and spineless and irrelevant these rulers are. The ruler of the biggest Muslim country in the Middle East, over 100 million people, is telling Israel, go ahead, push the population of Gaza over 2 million people, a genocidal crime against all the laws, against every humanitarian law, displace them, put them in the Naqab desert, go ahead, finish off Hamas, destroy Hamas, and then allow this population to return to Gaza if you want. Oh my God. And he said this, and this wasn't even remarked on, even by Jazeera. Not a single khatib seemed to have even noticed. We are so defeated, so broken, that even when our rulers speak as criminals, something like this would be enough for people who are actually alive, people who have a sense of awareness and pride, to overthrow the ruler. This is enough. This statement alone is enough, if the Egyptian people were actually living, to overthrow the ruler overnight just because he said that. How can you possibly suggest not a war crime, an absolute genocide against your fellow fellow Muslims, telling Israel, instead of pushing them upon us, throw them in the desert, go ahead, massacre Hamas, then if you want, allow them to. But of course, no reaction. I don't know if Egyptians even noticed. Any real Muslim that wants to find solutions for our ummah must confront the reality of how dead we are. I'll close with this. Of course, the toxic, the poison, the Emirat is the only country where there wasn't even a demonstration in support of Palestinians. The Emirat even banned the raising of Palestinian flags. If you've been listening to Emirati media, it is completely blaming the Palestinians for their own plight. It is the Palestinians' fault. It is the Palestinians who, in fact, they even implied in their media that it's probably true that Hamas is responsible, or Jihad is responsible, for bombing the hospital and so on. Hamza Yusuf was delivering a lecture in which he was effectively saying Hamas is at fault because they decided to rebel against their own oppression. And Islam expects you to just persevere and take your oppression because it's Allah's will. And that lecture that Hamza Yusuf was giving was promptly removed. So I expect that he even messed up more than the part that I've heard. And it became such an embarrassment that they removed it. But the solution begins with you. If you are the type of Muslim, who expects the person that you consider to be authoritative, that you consider to be representative of your religion and of the divine will, that defines who you are. And collectively, these choices define what our religion is. And collectively, these choices define what our reality is. I hope that we will wake up.